I was 32 years old when my sister smirked across the mahogany conference table and watched my father cut me out of his will. By then, I should have expected it. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. My father owned a regional logistics company he built from scratch. Warehouses, trucking contracts, mid-sized corporate clients. He wasn't flashy, but he was proud, structured, controlled. The kind of man who believed emotions were inefficiencies. My older sister, Claire, was his mirror image in ambition, but not in discipline. She was bold, charming, effortlessly social. Where I was cautious and observant, she was decisive and loud. Dad called her my closer. He called me the sensitive one. Sensitive, as if empathy were a defect. I worked in nonprofit financial compliance. I built stable systems. I audited grants. I made sure things didn't fall apart. Claire worked in Dad's company as director of business development, though everyone knew her real role was heir apparent. From childhood, the hierarchy was clear. Claire got the praise. I got the responsibility. If Claire broke a rule, Dad said she had initiative. If I questioned something, Dad said I lacked loyalty. The first red flag came years before the will reading. When Mom passed away, Dad leaned heavily on Claire in public, but privately, it was me he called at midnight. Me he asked to sort hospital invoices. Me who reviewed insurance paperwork. Me who sat at the kitchen table with spreadsheets, calculating estate tax exposure. Claire attended the memorial in a tailored black dress and delivered a flawless eulogy. I closed Mom's credit accounts and negotiated medical debt. At the time, I told myself that practicality was its own kind of love. If you've ever been underestimated, let me know in the comments. Dad's favoritism wasn't loud. It was strategic. He funded Claire's MBA outright. My graduate tuition? A character-building student loan. When I asked him about the discrepancy, he smiled thinly. Claire's education is an investment in the company. Yours is personal enrichment. That was the first time I felt the sting of being categorized as optional. Still, I kept showing up. When Dad's company faced a minor Department of Transportation compliance audit, Claire panicked. She called me crying, claiming regulators were harassing them. I took 3 days off work, reviewed their documentation, reorganized safety records, and drafted corrective action letters. The penalties were reduced by 60%. Dad shook my hand like I was a consultant. Claire hugged him like she'd saved the company. Years passed like that. Then Dad's health began to fail. Congestive heart failure. Nothing dramatic at first. Just fatigue. Then hospital stays. Then quiet meetings with attorneys. Claire moved into his guest house under the guise of helping. I visited on weekends, bringing groceries and reviewing medical billing errors. One evening, as I was leaving, I overheard Claire speaking to Dad in the den. She doesn't understand business risk, Dad. She's cautious to a fault. If something happens to you, the company needs someone decisive. And you're decisive? Dad asked. I'm loyal. There was a pause. Emily's emotional, Claire continued. She'd sell everything the first time it got hard. I stood in the hallway, invisible as usual. I didn't confront her. That was my mistake. The formal will reading happened 6 months after Dad's condition worsened. He was still alive, but he wanted clarity, he said. Estate planning updates. We met at his attorney's office downtown, Brennan and Cole, LLP. Neutral carpet, frosted glass. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Dad sat at the head of the table. Claire on his right. I sat across from her. She gave me a tight smile. It didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Brennan adjusted his glasses and began outlining revisions to Dad's estate plan. Primary residence to Claire. Company ownership shares. 80% to Claire, 20% to a senior executive under a vesting schedule. Investment portfolio, split, but weighted heavily toward Claire. Then came the line that made my pulse stall. Regarding Emily, Mr. Brennan said carefully, the revised instrument allocates no direct inheritance under the will. The room felt smaller. I looked at Dad. No direct inheritance? He didn't meet my eyes. You've always been independent. I assumed you'd prefer to make your own way. Claire's lips curved. Not a smile. A smirk. Subtle. Quick. But unmistakable. I felt heat climb my neck. So that's it? I'm just excluded. It's not exclusion, Claire interjected smoothly. It's strategic continuity. The company can't be fragmented. I never asked for the company. But you'd sell it, she replied calmly. Dad finally looked at me. This is about stability. Stability. As if I were chaos. I swallowed the humiliation. Is this final? Mr. Brennan cleared his throat. This is the most recent executed draft. Executed. Signed. Legal. My father had formalized what had always been true. I was the extra. No one deserves to feel invisible in their own family. I left that office in a fog. The city noise felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. I didn't cry immediately. I drove to a park near the river and sat in my car until dust settled. The betrayal wasn't about money. It was about narrative. Claire would inherit the legacy. I would inherit the implication that I was unworthy. When I confronted Dad privately days later, he was tired but lucid. You didn't even discuss it with me, I said. He sighed. You'd argue. I would have asked questions. Exactly. There it was. My flaw. Inquiry. Claire understands the pressure, he continued. You're different. Different how? He didn't answer directly. You don't fight. That stung more than the will. Because he was wrong. I just didn't fight the way Claire did. After that, Claire's behavior shifted. She became openly patronizing. At a family dinner, she raised her glass. To succession planning. Her gaze flicked to me. Some of us are built for leadership. I excused myself early. What happened next changed everything. 2 weeks later, I received a call, not from Dad, not from Claire, but from an unfamiliar number. Ms. Carter, the voice asked. Yes. This is Daniel Ruiz from Franklin Private Trust Services. I'm calling regarding a scheduled annual review meeting. I think you have the wrong person. Are you Emily Carter, born March 12, 1993? Yes, but then this concerns you. Your attendance is required. Required. My stomach tightened. What is this regarding? I'm not authorized to discuss specifics over the phone, but it pertains to a trust instrument established in your name. A trust instrument. In my name? I whispered. Yes. The initial funding occurred approximately 4 years ago. For years. Before Dad's diagnosis worsened. Before the revised will. I ended the call in a daze. Claire had been living in certainty. Dad had let her believe I was cut out entirely. But somewhere in the legal architecture of his estate, there was something else. I didn't tell Claire. I didn't tell Dad. For the first time in my life, I chose silence strategically. I scheduled the meeting. The Franklin Private Trust Services building was understated but formidable. Glass exterior, security desk, controlled access floors. Daniel Ruiz greeted me in a conference room overlooking the skyline. He was meticulous, calm, professional. Ms. Carter, before we proceed, I need to verify identity. He reviewed my ID, then opened a leather-bound folder. The Emily Carter Irrevocable Trust was established by your father, Jonathan Carter, in 2022. Irrevocable, not easily altered. Funded with what? I asked. A diversified portfolio, municipal bonds, index funds, and a minority share block in Carter Logistics Holdings. My breath caught. Minority share block? Yes. 25% of non-voting equity, convertible under specific triggering events. Triggering events. I gripped the edge of the table. Does Claire know? Daniel's expression didn't change. The trust is confidential. Beneficiary disclosure is restricted. I felt something unfamiliar unfurl in my chest. Not greed. Leverage. Dad had cut me out publicly. But privately, he'd secured something substantial. Why? I asked quietly. Daniel folded his hands. Your father cited asset protection and governance balance in the formation documents. Governance balance. He didn't trust Claire completely. He didn't trust me openly either. So he built a contingency. I left that building with copies of summary documents and a storm of thoughts. Claire believed she'd won. Dad believed he'd solved everything quietly. Neither of them knew I now understood the entire structure. I didn't confront Dad immediately. Instead, I began reading. Trust law, share conversion clauses, fiduciary obligations. The trust allowed conversion to voting shares if mismanagement or breach of fiduciary duty occurred within a company. Mismanagement, breach. Claire was ambitious. Ambition often cuts corners. For the first time, I saw the long game. I wasn't cut out. I was positioned. But positioned for what? That night, Claire called. "Dad wants us at dinner Sunday," she said lightly. "We should start discussing leadership transition more formally." Her tone carried effortless confidence. She believed the future was already signed and sealed. I agreed to attend. I would sit at that table knowing something she didn't. I would watch her smirk again. Only this time, I would understand the full architecture behind it. Would you have handled this differently? Sunday was approaching, and I was no longer the underestimated daughter walking into that house. I was the beneficiary of a hidden structure powerful enough to change everything. But I needed proof of something first, because a trust is only leverage if the triggering conditions are real. And I had a suspicion Claire was already making decisions she couldn't defend. When I walked into Dad's dining room that Sunday, she was seated at the head of the table. Dad beside her, documents stacked neatly. She smiled when she saw me, confident, unthreatened, completely unaware. And as she began outlining her vision for the company's future, I noticed something in the financial projections she slid across the table. Revenue assumptions that didn't align with current contracts. Aggressive debt leverage. A quiet refinancing plan Dad hadn't fully processed. Claire was moving fast. Too fast. I looked at Dad. He looked tired. Trusting. The hidden trust fund existed. But whether it would come to light depended on what Claire did next. And I had a feeling she was about to give me exactly what I needed. I didn't interrupt Claire while she presented her vision. That was new for me. Normally, I would have asked clarifying questions in real time. I would have pointed out inconsistencies gently, the way I did at work. Measured tone, collaborative phrasing. But that Sunday, I let her talk. She outlined a rapid expansion plan, acquiring 2 smaller regional carriers using leveraged debt financing. She projected a 22% revenue increase within 18 months. She proposed restructuring long-term contracts to free up cash flow for reinvestment. Dad nodded slowly, absorbing numbers that sounded impressive but dangerously optimistic. "Where are you sourcing the acquisition capital?" I asked calmly once she finished. "Commercial lending plus a private credit facility," she replied without hesitation. "The bank is comfortable with our asset base." "Which bank?" "Midwest Commercial." I made a mental note. Midwest Commercial had tightened underwriting standards last quarter. I knew because one of our nonprofit board members worked in their risk department. "And the covenants?" I asked. Claire's smile thinned slightly. "Standard leverage ratios." "That's vague." Dad sighed. "Emily, I'm just asking," I said softly. Claire leaned back. "Dad understands risk. He built this company. We can't operate like a charity." There was again the subtle jab, as if my nonprofit career meant I didn't understand capital structures. But I did, and what she was proposing required precision. When dinner ended, I hugged Dad goodbye and drove home in silence. That night, I opened the trust documents again. The conversion clause was clear. If a majority equity holder engaged in material misrepresentation to lenders, breached fiduciary duty, or jeopardized solvency through reckless leverage, the trustee had authority to convert my non-voting shares into voting shares for governance protection. Governance protection. Dad hadn't left me nothing. He'd left me oversight. He just hadn't told Claire. Or me. Tell me where you're listening from. Over the next month, I began preparing quietly. I didn't accuse Claire. I didn't confront Dad again. Instead, I scheduled a casual coffee with the senior executive who held the other 20% vesting shares. Mark Donovan, the operations director. Mark had worked for Dad for 15 years. Practical, loyal to the business more than any individual. "I'm worried about the acquisition plan," I told him carefully. He exhaled. "You should be." That surprised me. "Claire's pushing hard," he continued. "She wants scale before your dad's condition worsens." "Is the underwriting solid?" "They're stretching projections." "By how much?" "Enough that if fuel prices spike or a major client delays payment, we'd breach covenants." Breach. That word echoed. "Has Dad reviewed the full risk analysis?" I asked. Mark hesitated. "Claire filters what he sees." That was the first confirmation. Claire wasn't just ambitious. She was controlling the narrative. I didn't tell Mark about the trust. Not yet. Instead, I asked for something else. Would you be willing to copy me on board-level financial reports? He studied me. You're not on the board. Not publicly, I said quietly. He didn't press further. Over the next 6 weeks, documents began arriving in my inbox. Internal forecasts, loan drafts, covenant ratios. Claire had understated projected debt service coverage risk in her presentation to Dad. Not illegal, but dangerously optimistic. And optimism in leveraged finance can become negligence. Meanwhile, Claire grew bolder. At a company leadership meeting, one I attended as a family observer, she said openly, "We need decisive leadership. Emotional hesitation costs opportunity." Several managers glanced at me uncomfortably. She wasn't subtle anymore. Dad looked exhausted that day. He deferred to her repeatedly. I realized something important then. This wasn't about inheritance. It was about control before Dad passed. Claire wanted full narrative ownership of the legacy, and she believed I had none. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing. 3 months after the will reading, Claire finalized a term sheet with Midwest Commercial. The leverage ratio was higher than industry norms. The covenants included a personal guarantee clause requiring majority shareholder affirmation. Dad signed. I saw the scanned document in Mark's forwarded email. Claire had summarized the risks in 2 paragraphs. The full loan agreement was 87 pages. Dad hadn't read all 87. I knew because I asked him, "Did you review the liquidity stress scenarios?" I said during a quiet visit. "Claire did," he replied. "Dad," he looked irritated. "You think she's incompetent? I think she's confident." He studied me. "You're implying something. I'm asking you to read page 54. He didn't respond. But 2 days later, Mark called. "Your dad asked for an emergency board meeting." The pressure was escalating. Claire didn't like being questioned. At the board meeting, she was composed. "This is normal risk exposure for expansion," she insisted. "If we hesitate, competitors will outpace us." Dad asked about the covenant breach thresholds. She answered smoothly. Then Mark projected a sensitivity analysis on the screen. Fuel price increase of 12%. Client payment delay of 60 days. The debt service coverage ratio dipped below required minimums. Claire's jaw tightened. "These are worst-case hypotheticals," she said. "They're plausible," Mark replied. The room was tense. I stayed silent. Because I wasn't there to win an argument. I was there to observe pattern. Over the next quarter, Claire moved forward anyway. The acquisitions closed. Debt increased. Cash flow tightened. And then something predictable happened. One of their largest clients delayed payment after an internal restructuring. 45 days turned into 60. Fuel prices climbed modestly. Not catastrophic, but enough. Midwest Commercial issued a covenant compliance notice. Technically, it was a warning. But warnings are documented. Documented instability matters. That's when I contacted Daniel Ruiz. "We may be approaching a triggering event," I told him. He requested financial documentation. I forwarded everything. 2 weeks later, he called me back. "There is a credible argument that the majority shareholder engaged in material risk understatement during loan negotiation," he said. "The trustee will initiate formal review." My pulse raced. This was real now. The trustee's review process required notification to the company's legal counsel. Claire would find out. She found out on a Tuesday morning. I was at work when my phone lit up. "Claire." I let it ring twice before answering. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Good morning. Don't play innocent. A trustee contacted our attorney. Something about governance review." "I didn't do anything illegal," I said calmly. "Are you involved?" "Yes." Silence crackled. "What are you talking about?" "I'm a beneficiary of an irrevocable trust Dad established 4 years ago." She laughed once. Sharp. Disbelieving. "That's not possible." "It is." Another pause. "How much?" "Enough." Her voice hardened. Dad would have told me. Apparently not. The overconfidence I'd seen for months fractured in that moment. "You're trying to sabotage me," she said. "I'm trying to protect the company. You've always hated that I was chosen." "I was never trying to be chosen." We ended the call, unresolved. That evening, Dad called me. His voice was tired but steady. "You knew," he said quietly. "Yes." For how long? Since before the will reading. He inhaled slowly. I wanted balance, he admitted. Claire is bold. You are cautious. I thought if something went wrong. You didn't trust her entirely. I trust her ambition, he said. I trust your restraint. That was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging my value. Dad, the loan terms were riskier than presented. He didn't argue. I know, he said after a moment. That was the turning point. The trustee scheduled a formal governance review meeting at Brennan & Cole. Claire, Dad, company counsel, the trustee representative, and me. The same conference room where I'd been cut out of the will. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Claire arrived composed but tight. Dad looked friendlier than before. Mr. Brennan reviewed the trust instrument aloud. Under Section 4.2, in the event of material misrepresentation or reckless endangerment of corporate solvency by a majority shareholder, the trustee may convert non-voting shares to voting shares for governance stabilization. Claire interrupted. There was no misrepresentation. The trustee representative spoke calmly. Our analysis indicates that risk exposure disclosures to the majority shareholder were incomplete. Claire looked at Dad. You read everything. Dad hesitated. Silence filled the room. That hesitation was louder than any accusation. The trustee continued. Based on the review, we are exercising conversion rights. I felt the shift physically. A legal click into place. My 25% non-voting equity converted to voting shares. Combined with Mark's vested 20%, Claire no longer held unilateral control. The power dynamic changed in a sentence. Claire stared at me. You planned this, she said quietly. No, it'll be You did. The financial/legal twist was clean. No drama. No shouting. Just signatures and percentages. Claire still owned a significant stake, but she was no longer untouchable. After the meeting, she cornered me in the hallway. You think this makes you a leader? I think it makes me accountable. You've always hidden behind caution, and you've always hidden behind confidence. She searched my face for doubt. There was none. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Over the next 6 months, governance shifted. Major capital expenditures required joint approval. Financial reporting transparency improved. Debt was restructured conservatively. Claire adjusted begrudgingly. Dad stepped back further. One evening, he asked me to visit alone. I misjudged you, he said quietly. I didn't gloat. I just needed you to see me, I replied. He nodded. When he passed away a year later, the will still reflected what it always had. Claire inherited the majority estate assets. Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, everything had, because the trust remained, and the voting rights remained. Claire never smirked at me again. Our relationship is not warm, but it is balanced. She respects the architecture now. Sometimes walking away is the strongest move you can make. I didn't walk away from the company, but I walked away from needing her approval. The hidden trust fund didn't make me rich overnight. It made me visible. It ensured that when my sister smirked at the will reading, she didn't know the full story. And in the end, neither did I, until it mattered. Would you have handled this differently?